Chapter 3. Anxiety. Anxiety is the fear of being hurt or of losing something. Whether the fear is real or imagined, it feels the same. Anxiety varies from the mild apprehension of someone testing the temperature of the water before going swimming, to the disorganizing panic of a person unable to control his bodily functions. Between these two extremes are feelings of being fearful, scared, edgy, jittery, concerned, worried, helpless, insecure, uptight, nervous, having cold feet, getting the shakes, all degrees of a feeling of uncertainty over one's personal safety. Fear, like all feelings, serves an important purpose, in this case, to alert us to defend ourselves. So when people try to pretend they're not afraid, they seldom do themselves any good. Fear protects us, and we ignore it at our peril, whether out of a desire to appear strong, or to evade the truth of our feelings. When fear warns us of danger, it's summarizing all the information being received by the five senses. Fear calls our attention to a possible threat to our well-being. When you're exposed to a threat, your body responds by releasing powerful stimulating hormones into the bloodstream. These hormones make the heart beat more strongly and more rapidly and also direct blood flow to where it's needed most. In a time of stress, the blood supply is usually diminished to the abdomen and the skin, and is increased to the muscles. Most of the physical symptoms of anxiety, cold feet, butterflies in the stomach, sweating, dilation of the pupils of the eyes and skin pallor, are caused by these hormones. These stress hormones also make our minds race, and increase our awareness of our surroundings. An excess of this puts us constantly on guard, which in turn tends to immobilize. Children living in cities under attack during wartime, for example, become so defensive in the face of chronic anxiety they seem to lose their personality. Most of us can't survive chronic anxiety without serious emotional consequences. The intensity of anxiety often depends on the severity of the impending loss, the closeness of the threat, the importance of the loss to the individual, and the strength of the person and his defenses. What are most of us most anxious about? The answer generally is losing our lives. Any psychology that doesn't consider the importance of the instinct to survive hasn't much to do with reality. Few of us actually observe the instinct for self-preservation operating in real life, but we can detect or at least respond to it fairly readily in the world of fantasy. For example, the great adventure story or film grips us and holds us in our seats as we identify with fictitious people threatened by powerful, seemingly invincible creatures, spirits, holocausts, earthquakes, sharks. The involvement these adventures arouse reflects our basic survival instinct. The feeling of taking a risk and surviving is invigorating. It gives a new sense of life. That surely is one reason why sports that involve risk are so stirring. In the real world, anxiety is common enough, but the potential aggressors in our lives are seldom so clearly defined. They're more likely to be represented by the local bureaucracy that asks us to fill out a dozen meaningless forms during an emergency, wasting our time and causing us needless stress. Or a government spending our money irresponsibly and threatening us with jail if we don't pay our taxes, or inflation or recession and their threat of unemployment. We often feel helpless confronting these threats. The aggressor is simply too powerful. Sometimes we're not even sure where the threat is coming from. The government, the economy are giant abstract threats, threats without faces or an approachable personality. Movie makers, novelists and television writers create adventures for us in which threats at least become identified as real characters who can be sought out, overcome or outlived. Our anxiety is stirred up, we see the enemy defeated and we feel a sense of release from our own unease. Most of us live lives in which much of the anxiety we experience is out of our control. We look for ways to express our instinct of survival, or end our feeling of helplessness. Our survival instinct is awakened not solely from an actual threat of death, but also from a more general fear of dying. Most people fear the horrible finality that will dispatch them to nothingness, to non-being. When confronting impending death, such as finding yourself in the path of a runaway automobile, the events of your life are often vividly recalled. This abrupt playback of past events comes from a sudden indiscriminate loosening of the defenses, allowing you to see the world within and the world outside more clearly, as they really are. Defenses are a delaying tactic. They slow reactions, protect you from potential emotional hurt. There is a time for defenses and a time for survival. Fortunately, under great stress, the decision is out of our hands. The lifting of defenses becomes an instinctive act of survival. The mind is open to seek out safety. This 11th hour opening of consciousness has also been seen in mental hospitals where, when faced with imminent death, some severely disturbed mute patients have occasionally begun to speak with feeling about their lives. It's as if the threat of death offered such great punishment that there was nothing left for these patients to repress, and so they could act without the restriction that shaped their behavior for so many years. Most of us rarely feel threatened for our immediate physical survival. We have little sense of a real physical threat being overcome and the enjoyment of relief that brings. Our modern age probably has deprived us of something by removing us from direct personal contact with the elements of nature. We find ourselves in an artificial arena where our adversaries are arbitrary employers, demanding schedules, unfair practices, and red tape, all of which create feelings of frustration and threaten us without giving us adequate opportunity for expressing our feelings about our condition. We live in an unfair emotional bondage. We've been coerced into selling out our instinct for personal survival for something called long-term security, without being told beforehand of the consequences. We never imagined that in our day-to-day living and working experience we'd be most threatened by our protectors. Worse, we seem to have few resources left to combat such threats, because to fight the system seems overwhelming. Don Quixote may have known what he was doing when he chose windmills as adversaries. If we were to examine the system, we'd see that the security it offers is elusive. It depends on the system working. When hard times come, the system isn't working and the loyalty of the company toward its employees may be difficult to discern, and the situation may produce more anxiety than security. The modern world is driving many of us crazy. The answer is that each of us, to whatever extent possible, must take our survival back into our own hands. We may not do as well financially, but if we can lower the anxiety level by being more in control of our own destiny, we've come out ahead. When it seems impossible to manage directly the stress of working for a corporation or contending with government bureaucracy, other outlets for resolving tension have got to be found. One such is a sport that offers physical and emotional challenge that can be met and overcome. It's very rewarding to pit oneself against a mountain in winter and conquer the steepest slopes. You may not have beaten the boss, you certainly have not made the tax laws any more equitable, but you have overcome a real challenge, and you have demonstrated your ability to make it. The system may no longer work, but you still do. It's our modern civilization itself that's at the root of a great deal of our anxiety and stress. Industrialization has often progressed at the expense of the individual. The exigencies of corporate and industrial life dictate that we suppress our instinct for survival and suffer in silence the anxieties such a life produces, a depleting experience, because to suppress any emotion requires energy. To live in a world where some company professes to know what's best for us and expects us to go along blindly with its policies is putting the survival of that company above our own. No company or organization that places the survival of itself over the well-being of any single member can ever act in keeping with the real needs of the individual. We sense this and feel uncomfortable on the job, a little used, perhaps, a little like an impersonal number. Many businesses today are creating products on one end of the assembly line and dehumanized workers on the other. Working with faceless machines in which one's only interest is in keeping one's hands or clothing out of the gears is boring. The usual way people defend themselves against such monotony is to block it out and retreat into the world within. This turning away from the world only adds to the feeling of boredom. Anxiety and boredom tend to go hand in hand, and often result in such disorders as depression and alcoholism. This sense of helplessness in a mechanized world gradually undermines our ability to take charge of our private lives. We tend to erect such a protective screen against our anxiety at work that when we return home those same screens stay with us. When we look for the nurturing and love that we're missing on the job, we're often disappointed as we frequently make unrealistic demands on those we love to compensate us for our unhappiness. Often our stressful anxiety makes it difficult for us to see that those we turn to at home also have their own needs. As work stress increases, so does the imperviousness of our defenses, and the richness of our personal and family life diminishes. Often we don't recognize what's really happening until the damage has already been done. The intimacy of the family unit is undermined. The husband feels unfulfilled, the wife feels martyred, the children rebel. We tolerate such situations because we don't recognize or admit the problem. We reason that the times aren't the best, that one should be thankful for bread on the table. But what job is truly worth this kind of emotional suicide? It is little better, sometimes worse, than nothing. We can only react purposefully to a threat if we perceive it. Few of us are so self-aware that we're able to understand exactly what we fear, and therefore we're unable to relieve fully our feeling of anxiety. Some are even unaware that what they are feeling is anxiety. Just what does it feel like to be anxious? First, you feel uncertain, agitated, or unsettled. There's a growing sense that something bad is about to happen, a vague sense of impending loss. Events seem to be out of your control and working to your disadvantage. How do you cope with these feelings? Before you can do anything about your anxiety, you must first be able to admit that you are anxious. This may not be as simple as it sounds. Many people have peculiar notions about their feelings. They believe to admit feeling frightened is to admit being weak. They deny their anxiety and try to pretend nothing's wrong. Whenever you deny your anxiety, you only undermine your ability to defend yourself from whatever is threatening. To say that you're not anxious is the same as saying there's no threat. How then do you explain your feelings? And what purpose do they serve? When you feel anxious, you're perceiving a threat even though you may not be aware of it. Don't ignore anxiety. It means that something you consider important is being threatened. When a person has a severe perceptual problem, he often distorts the reality he confronts. The world of a deaf or blind person differs greatly from the world of the rest of us. Yet the world of a blind or deaf person differs less from that of a sighted person or one who hears, than it does from a person who is so rigid in his defense that he alters reality. A blind person lacks only sight, not perspective. A deaf person lacks sound, not understanding. Such people have their own ways of perceiving reality. Handicapped people have less room to operate, less margin for error than others. Their alertness and ease in responding to a warning feeling such as anxiety is a measure of this. They pay greater attention to their working senses and consequent feelings, and as a result are often more aware of the world around them than the rest of us. Lighting a match in the same room as a blind person frequently makes him agitated, and he immediately seeks out the source of the smoke. This increased alertness to smell is a compensation for his loss of sight. It's not only that the handicapped person is more acute in his remaining senses, the rest of us have had our senses so bombarded by our environment that we tend to block out the incoming stimuli that would alert us to what's threatening. Each of us needs to raise his awareness of his own feelings and perceptions. This doesn't mean that, like the blind person, we must investigate every puff of smoke, but certainly we ought to be aware that the smoke is there so that we can be ready to react as necessary. If we try to block out what makes us anxious, what frightens us, we set ourselves up for greater suffering. Better to do something about problems when they're small and can most easily be coped with. If we constantly block a threat from our awareness, it consumes more and more energy. As grows, it eventually does break through and overwhelm us. When a defense stands between you and your ability to perceive your true feelings, it also stands between you and your best chance of survival. To be anxious is to feel uncomfortable. It's supposed to feel uncomfortable. If anxiety weren't uncomfortable, people wouldn't do anything to get rid of it. The feeling of anxiety is best removed by removing the threat that caused it, not by defensively denying or ignoring it. If you're in danger, you should know it. If you rely on someone else to act in your best interests when you're threatened, then something is very wrong in your life. To place responsibility for your safety in another person or in an institution may be helpful in quieting your fears for the moment, but eventually it undermines the natural process of self-survival. Being anxious and afraid may tend to bring back childish feelings of helplessness, but admitting you're afraid doesn't mean that you're a child. When we feel afraid, it's only natural to wish that someone bigger, more capable and powerful, will come to our rescue. Such fond childhood hopes tend to wither naturally in the shadow of adult experience. We see more clearly every day, if we're looking, that the only person we really can count on for help is ourselves. Modern society sends us two conflicting messages: be self-reliant, be yourself, take charge of your own destiny, conform, play the game, be a good citizen. Individuality is often labeled eccentricity, tolerated in theory only. Conformity is expected in practice. Meeting our obligations to society and earning its prescribed rewards too often may not fulfill our emotional needs. We want something more but don't know where to look. What we find is a sea of anxiety. Out of fear, we tend to follow a course chosen by others who claim to know the right direction. No wonder so many of us feel anxious so much of the time. We're beginning to lose our initiative, our sense of ourselves, of our own life's goal and purpose. For many, these words may sound inconsistent with the hard, cold, practical facts of life. A person has to work, to get along, or worry about being fired. Well, yes and no. That's the message we've been conditioned to accept. It isn't necessarily the reality of our best interest or even survival. It's the message of somebody else, of a structure that has its own self-interest, not necessarily the same or even consistent with the individuals in question. A fact of life is that many of us give up or give in too easily, without even looking for alternatives or testing them. We fear the uncertainty of newness. This does not mean that we should give up job, family, and society for some mystical inner voice. But at least give your best self a chance. Listen to yourself, accept your responsibility for solving the threats to your life and well-being, at least to the extent that you can from the resources within you. This at least is a start at being a free person. And isn't that what we're all supposed to be about? Aside from the anxiety created simply by our society, each person needs to come to terms with the threats and fears of his own interpersonal life, based on the prejudices of his upbringing. Whether the object of the prejudice is a group, an idea, or an attitude, a prejudice is only altered by experience. As children, we learn our prejudices out of fear. What begins as a fear of a specific object, situation, or person tends to become generalized. A fear of a dark place, for example, becomes fear of the dark. Our prejudices are like reservoirs of bad feelings and get in the way of our finding the truth. We fear the stranger only partly because he may cause us harm, but more because he is not party to our particular perception of the truth. What he says about us derives from what he perceives about us. We tend to fear the stranger because he can see our imperfections, because he may hurt us by uncovering the truth about ourselves. Each of us feels vulnerable in a different way. If you know your vulnerability, you know a great deal about yourself. As we've seen, everyone is vulnerable to the loss of a loved one, the loss of control, and the loss of self-esteem. Each of these types of loss creates a corresponding category of anxiety. Some people are so sensitized by their particular life experience that one of these categories takes precedence over others and colors the way they see the world. Dependent people are especially vulnerable to loss of love, either because as children they experienced such a loss or because they lived with the threat of separation or rejection. They go through life feeling a loss even before they have lost anything. They may even precipitate a potential loss just to get their anxiety over with. They often create a feeling of helplessness in other people, who feel angry at them for making them feel that way and reject them, and so another loss. Because dependent people tend to act in a regressive and infantile way when threatened, little they do seems effective in preventing the losses they fear. Their unwillingness to assume responsibility for their life only adds to their grief and further alienates the very people whose love and affection they fear losing. Dependent people see the world in terms of loss or rejection and are likely to find evidence everywhere they look that such a loss is imminent. Take this case, for example, of a woman who was so wounded by losses and separations as a child that she saw the losses woven into the fabric of her life more clearly than she saw her life itself. One afternoon, when storming out of her daughter-in-law's house after an argument, she began to feel abandoned by the act of her own leaving. She drove along the superhighway following another car. After a few miles she began to feel a peculiar attachment to it. In her mind the other automobile was showing her the way home. It was taking care of her. The farther away from her daughter-in-law's home she drove, the more old feelings of abandonment as a child returned. After a while the car she was following turned off the highway and she was left in tears, feeling abandoned by the world and unable, literally and figuratively, to find her own way home. This woman's experience is typical of the ways incidents in our present can trigger the unsettled sorrows of our past, making the world a screen on which we project our hurts. The next kind of loss that produces anxiety is the loss of control. Whether it's power, money, position, influence, or title that we value most, few of us look as unhappy or as desperate as controlling people who feel they're about to lose control. People who most fear losing control are those who make a special point of being in control all the time. They live by rules. They feel most comfortable when they know the precise limits of a given situation. They can relax only when they're sure they understand how everything fits. Even then they may be on the lookout for things that could go wrong and they invent extra routines to perform to make certain that what hasn't gone wrong won't. When things do start to get out of control they tend to get more and more involved in the rules and details of the system and begin to regard them with an air of permanency or even religiousness. They imbue them with a ritualistic or magical quality in an effort to exorcise their anxiety. Consider a lady or gentleman who makes a revision of the shopping list by rows to correspond with the supermarket displays, who keeps the house pristine, who pays bills by return mail, whose checkbook balances to the penny, whose calendar is planned months ahead, thereby getting the unknown under control as well. Is this person really in control? In fact, for many controlling people, their order and routine seem more important than their feelings. Because the loss of control is so frightening, they try to control the pieces of their world in increasingly minute detail, making still longer and more accurate lists, keeping a still neater house or office. They would do better to admit they feel hurt and anxious and to realize that this is what makes them feel out of control. When you experience a feeling without hiding it, it passes most quickly and drains you the least. The loss of esteem also triggers anxiety. It may appear as a fear of failure, a fear of being exposed as worthless, or a fear of being ridiculed. People who live in fear of being embarrassed often try to hide their real feelings. They may pretend that their feelings are unimportant, or that the test of their worth didn't count, as for example the student who goes through school barely passing because he's afraid of taking the risk of trying and not being the best, He can always tell himself, if I'd really studied I could have been first in the class. He may even believe it. Such people are often competitive and unsure of their worth at the same time. They feel anxious not only when they're put down, but when other people exceed them. They rarely act as themselves, but in a way they think will make them appear worthwhile to others. They rarely make an honest effort to succeed, but just enough to give the impression of success. Ironically, the effort needed to succeed is usually only a little more than that required to save face. True success can't be achieved until you're willing to be judged on your performance. Not wanting to be so judged, a person overly concerned with esteem shies away from making a full effort in order to protect his fragile self-image. He really isn't sure he could be first, and not knowing how well he could do, he dreads ever finding out. All these three issues of anxiety-producing loss reflect growth stages everybody has lived through. To the extent that these issues of the past continue unresolved in us, we remain vulnerable to similar situations in the present. And to some degree all three issues, losing love, control, or esteem, are capable of triggering feelings of anxiety in each of us. Now the question is, how do we go about managing anxiety? Since anxiety is a warning, it's vital that we first understand what dangers we're being alerted to. The warning must be broken down into usable information. Sometimes it's awfully difficult to tell if the danger causing the alarm is in the present or in the past. The lady who became attached to the car she was following simply couldn't make that distinction. When she was a young child, her mother had gone off advance. She's able to enjoy life because it's no longer automatically tainted by the past. Managing anxiety primarily in the present is less difficult. When you feel anxious for reasons not clear to you, or when a situation that should make you happy only makes you feel threatened, stop and think. The first step in getting control over anxious situations is to ask yourself, what is it I'm so afraid of losing? Asking that question sometimes gives enough distance to begin to solve the problem. The question begins to define the answer. The office worker afraid to ask for the raise, the tenant afraid to arouse the ire of his neighbor whose radio blasts him deaf every night, the boy afraid to ask the girl for a date, and vice versa in these changing times. All may feel generally anxious without knowing why until they begin to stop and think and ask themselves the question, what am I afraid of losing? And in reply may come, respectively, the answers, my job, friendship, my masculinity, my femininity. Most people face some anxiety every day of their lives. Lawyers become anxious when they have to appear in court. Accountants become anxious before an audit. Professors become tense when they have to lecture. Students become worried before exams. Hostesses become jittery before a party. Directors become distraught before opening night. Theirs is preparation anxiety. It's the fear of being a flop, of losing face. This anxiety, in moderate amounts, helps to get a person charged up to do his best. It's common to everyone who stands up to be counted. But often the level of anxiety associated with performing is so high that it keeps many even from trying. Moderate so-called stage fright, however, is not a disease, and only when it actually prevents you from working does it need to be treated. Some people, though, live their lives as if they were giving one continuous performance after another every hour of the day. They fear they're being judged by everyone who sees them. Because they've not accepted themselves, they worry no one else could either. They're afraid of being confirmed as worthless. They live from one unsatisfying event to another, wondering who'll find them out next. Chronic anxiety is difficult to manage and painful to endure. A person suffering from it feels constantly as if he were about to suffer a great loss. He uses up most of his energy trying to hold his anxiety in check. As a result, even small amounts of stress quickly overwhelm his ability to cope. As his defenses become spread over too wide an area in an attempt to cover all possible threats, his anxiety begins to leak out everywhere. Defenses become useless. In fact, he becomes so caught up in the management of his defenses that he has little energy left over to live. Managing such severe anxiety may require professional help, including an anti-anxiety medication, so that a person is able to regain some of the energy used by his defenses and apply it to solving his problems. It's difficult for therapy to have much success until anxiety is reduced to manageable levels. There's nothing like feeling better to feel better. Chronic anxiety is aggravated by the stresses of day-to-day living, traffic, shopping, the media, the demands of a family, personal relationships, not to mention the economy, the unsure prospect for the world, shortages, aging and disease. Many people suffer from anxiety without realizing it because their defenses against anxiety keep them from being aware of themselves. The defensiveness of the average New Yorker is a good example. They have to shut out a lot each day just to get breakfast down. Our society makes emotional cripples out of many people who can't cope with the lack of clear-cut goals and rewards that have little real meaning. We still need some space, time, privacy and peace, if only for a few minutes each day. We need an opportunity to get in contact with ourselves, to listen to our thoughts, to pay attention to our feelings. Even though it seems impossible at times, the best way to manage anxiety is to avoid unnecessarily threatening situations and to begin to make yourself the most complete and strongest person you can be. To do this, you need to accept who you are, take responsibility for your life, and make certain that you are heading in the direction that is right for you. This is a difficult job. To be one's own person, you need to not be entirely free of anxiety, but at least you can know what you fear and be free to change what threatens you. A free person accepts responsibility for both the good and the bad in his life. He is aware of his own vulnerability, and instead of concealing it, he uses it. He allows himself to be open to the pain of his world. Through that special window he can see more clearly, because he feels more. A free person doesn't waste time and energy getting involved in things that can't be changed, but instead focuses on the areas he can affect. He doesn't let the world get to him. He simply defines what his goals are and works honestly and energetically toward them. One of the most important goals of life is to become familiar with yourself in a positive way. To reach this point requires acceptance of your limitations. You need to understand that no matter how badly you may have been treated or what your personal circumstances happen to be, no matter how cruelly abandoned or rejected you may have been or where you are in life now, you are always in charge of your own life. You have the primary responsibility to make good on your talents and abilities. Hopefully the disappointments and rejections you experience will someday be seen as a proving ground for you. If you're a person who's been brought up in a dependent way, your outlook need not always be one of disappointment and hurt over losses. Your own special sensibilities about being dependent may allow you to become a person with extraordinary nurturing qualities that allow you to identify with and help people who haven't yet outgrown their dependent ties. Once a person has overcome his own dependency problems, he becomes free to give, to support, to encourage and to sustain, to do everything that's the opposite of draining other people. The anxiety he felt in being afraid of dependent losses will gradually disappear as he begins to see himself as a person of strength. In the same manner, controlling people, once they learn to overcome their defensiveness, also have a great deal to give. They have a special understanding of loneliness and isolation. People who've learned to overcome their need to be in control all the time can be very helpful to others in showing them how to organize and reach toward a self-fulfilling goal. And people who've been anxious about self-esteem can learn to be less self-centered and more concerned with the job they're doing than the impression they make on others. They can learn to respect what they do for itself rather than constantly worry about being worthy in the eyes of others. So when weaknesses are converted into strengths, people are transformed from dependent, controlling or esteem-seeking members of society to nurturers, managers, and performers, and each has a great deal to give and teach the others. Although anxiety carries the threat of impending loss and injury, it doesn't obscure the very positive and real aspects of its other function, to alert and build up the self into its highest potential. We can do this by accepting the hurts that have come to each of us, having done with the pain, learning the lessons of our early experiences, and growing into the best person we can salvage from our past and create through the actions of our present. Each of us is the architect of his own future, and if we use our best personal building materials, we have nothing to fear. Merely being on the road to the discovery of one's best self lowers anxiety. The rest is work in time. Everyone moves at his own pace and in his own way. No one can create your life for you. No one is supposed to. Others may point the way, help define your goals, but the work, the burden, the responsibility, and therefore the joy, are yours alone.